So, have you ever wondered what you'd actually learn in a full-blown university course on violence? Well, we've basically taken all the key lectures, the big theories, the surprising data, and boiled it all down into one crash course. And we're going to start at the very beginning.
Okay, so let's kick things off with a really fundamental question. When is an act a crime? I mean, it sounds simple, right? But the answer? It totally depends on who you're asking and what kind of lens you're looking through. You see, society pretty much uses two main playbooks to deal with this stuff. On one hand, you've got the public health perspective. They see violence kind of like a disease, an intentional injury that, we should try to prevent. But then you've got the criminal justice perspective. They see it as a crime that we need to react to, with things like punishment and deterrence. So it's prevention versus reaction. And that's a huge tension in how we handle violence. All right, so before we can really dig in and analyze this, we all need to be on the same page. We need a shared language. So what is violence, really? And maybe more importantly, who gets to decide? Well, that who decides question, it kind of breaks down into three main schools of thought. First, there's the consensus view, which says, hey, society pretty much agrees on what's right and wrong. Then you've got the conflict view, which is a bit more cynical. It says that laws are basically just tools made by the powerful to protect their own interests. And finally, the constructionist view argues that violence is socially constructed. It's whatever we, as a group, decide to label as violent. And that last one leads to this really fascinating idea from the sociologist Emil Durkheim. He came up with this thought experiment he called a society of saints. Imagine a place filled with perfect people, right? Well, Durkheim argued that even their tiny little faults, things we wouldn't even notice, would suddenly become these huge, scandalous crimes. His point was that every society needs a certain amount of deviance. It's almost like a necessary social function to define what's normal. Okay, so we have a working definition, or at least a few ways to think about one. But how do we explain why violence happens in the first place? This is where we get into the different theoretical toolkits that researchers use. So the classic theories give us a few different blueprints for understanding violence. You've got anomie, which suggests violence pops up when social norms just kind of break down. Then there's social disorganization, which points the finger at things like poverty and constant turnover in a neighborhood. Strain theory says it's a reaction to stress, like when people's goals are blocked. And then there's routine activities theory, which gives us this super simple 3-ingredient recipe. You just need a motivated offender, a suitable victim, and nobody around to stop it. But, obviously, no single one of those theories can tell the whole story. That's why the modern approach is something called the biopsychosocial model. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It integrates everything from our biology, our psychology, and our social world to create a much more complete picture. So let's break that down for a second. On the biological level, you could be looking at things like a less developed prefrontal cortex, which can lead to more impulsivity. Psychologically, it could be about poor self-regulation. You know that famous marshmallow test with the kids? That's a perfect example. And then socially, it's about how we can learn violent behaviors from our peers in our environment. The key takeaway here is that it's the interaction of all three that really matters. Okay, so we've got the theories down, but what does this all look like in the real world? When we look at the data, who is most often the victim and who's the perpetrator? Well, the data is pretty stark. This chart here uses something called the Gini index. It's basically just a score that measures economic inequality in a society, from low to high. And the pattern is just undeniable. As that inequality score goes up, so do homicide rates. It's one of the strongest, most consistent predictors of violence that we have. Another pattern that's been noticed for a long time, this one was pointed out way back in 1951 by Veli Vercoe, is the strong link between violence and young men. Now, his phrasing was pretty dated. He said women live in a more peaceful atmosphere, but the core observation that young men are disproportionately involved in violence, that holds true across different cultures and decades. All right, now let's zoom in, like way in. Let's move from the big picture of society down to the micro level. What's actually happening emotionally in the seconds during a violent encounter? Sociologist Randall Collins has this incredible concept called the tunnel of violence. See, most of the time, that tension and fear we feel in a confrontation actually acts as a barrier. It stops fights from happening. But if one side suddenly gains total dominance, like say the other person trips and falls, it can trigger what he calls a forward panic. The attacker basically loses control and just enters this frenzied, chaotic state. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. This quote here is from a real witness in a study on youth violence, and it just captures that feeling perfectly. They said they went completely berserk. They couldn't stop with it. It's not a controlled fight, it's a total loss of control, where the rage itself just seems to take over. So we've got the raw emotions of the moment, but what about external factors? What are the things that can pour gasoline on the fire and turn a tense situation into a lethal one? Well, researchers usually point to three major facilitators. First, drugs. They're linked in a few ways: the chemical effects on the brain, the economic need to get money for them, and the systemic violence of the drug trade itself. Then there's alcohol, which, believe it or not, has a stronger link to aggression than any other substance. And finally, firearms. And their role is really complex. You have theories arguing they increase how lethal a fight is, others say they might encourage attacks, and some even argue they could deter violence.
And that brings us to our final section. And honestly, it might be the most unsettling one. We've talked about violence on the streets, in society, and involving different substances. But where does most of it actually happen?
This quote from researchers Gellis and Strauss is pretty shocking. Let it sink in for a second. With the exception of the police and the military, the family is perhaps the most violent social group, and the home the most violent social setting. Statistically, you are far more likely to be hurt by a family member in your own home than by anyone else, anywhere else. The place we think of as the safest is often the most dangerous. And you have to understand, intimate partner violence isn't usually a one-time thing. It's a cycle. It's a trap. First, tension builds. Then, the incidence of abuse happens. But right after, there's this reconciliation, this honeymoon phase with apologies and promises. And then a period of calm before the tension starts building all over again. This is a huge reason why it is so incredibly difficult for victims to just leave. And this whole cycle is held together by these chilling tactics of control. It's not just about physical violence. Perpetrators will work to socially isolate their victims. They'll deny reality through gaslighting. They'll control their partner's job, their body, even their access to a doctor. It's all about power and control. So, as we wrap up this crash course, we're left with one final and really crucial question. If the data shows that the home, the family unit, is often the most violent setting in our society, then it really forces us all to ask, where does the work of prevention truly begin?